Welcome back to Inside the GMAT. I'm your host, Zach. What's the one thing more difficult than studying for an exam? Trying to figure out how to study for an exam, when to begin, how often to study, how long to study. Isn't there anyone who can teach us how to prep? Why, yes, there is. Meet Stacey Koprince, Director of Content and Curriculum at Manhattan Prep. Maybe you already know her. With more than 15 years teaching the GMAT, GRE, and even the LSAT, she's one of the most well-known instructors in the industry, and I wanted to chat with Stacey about the entire B-School prep process, from the pre-prep prep that goes into picking schools and program types, to the nitty-gritty of how to actually structure your prep to earn a top score. So whether you're just starting to consider business school or you're already deep into GMAT prep, today's episode will be the intro-level course you need to navigate your studying successfully. Stacey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. Okay, so I know that today we're going to talk a lot about prepping for business school exams, but before we crack open those prep books and talk about sort of the content that's on a lot of these exams, I know, and you know, and our listeners know that preparing for business school starts before that actual studying begins. So before we start that, I want to ask the question that a lot of folks are probably asking themselves, is business school right for me? How do we answer that question for them?
Yeah, and that's a big question, right? If you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, you pretty much have to go to med school or law school. But if you want to be a business person, you don't have to get an MBA. So yes, it's a big question, and the answer is not the same for everybody. There are plenty of people who have very successful careers in business who have never gotten an MBA. And so there are lots of things you could think about. There are a few big things that I would concentrate on. I went through this myself, trying to decide if I wanted an MBA once
Same.
upon a
I
time.
love that we're asking these questions, but we know the answers.
Right. I totally did this myself. So the first thing is just thinking, like, what is this going to do for me? Where do I want to be immediately post MBA? Where do I want to be 5 to 10 years? Where do I want my career to go? Um, and there are differences too in terms of, am I changing industries? I don't really want to change industries once I'm 10 years into my career and then have to start over at the bottom and build back up again. That's really painful.
Yes.
So one way to jumpstart that would be to have an advanced degree so that you're starting out at a higher level, a higher starting point when you make that career switch. So that could be one thing as a way to break into a new area. Another could be depending on the industry that you're in. In some industries, it really is, if you want to get into management, you're just a lot more likely to either have that path happen at all or to have it happen on a faster time frame if you've got an MBA. So a lot of this is very individual to your situation and what's going on in your career. But I would say those are two of the big reasons why people do this. They're either looking to stay in their same area, but jump faster, push forward, push ahead faster, or they're looking to switch industries and don't want to have to start all the way at the bottom again in the new industry.
And there's also an environmental consideration as well, right? Here we are filming this conversation in March 2025, and the economy is sort of the elephant in the room, especially in North America right now, but I think all over the world. Is this sort of economic uncertainty an indicator of how to proceed?
Absolutely. We basically call business school or graduate management education in general, we call it counter-cyclical to the economy. You're going to go to B school, so you start to learn those kinds of words.
Write that down.
Yeah, right. Which is a fancy way of saying basically when the economy is good, people stay in their jobs and they don't go to grad school as much. And when the economy is not so good as we're facing now, you start to see an uptick in people who are interested in going to grad school. And that could be because wages are stagnating. It could be because of layoffs. It could be because you're worried that you might get laid off. There are a number of reasons, but that uncertainty, people are looking for plan B. And one of the options for plan B is definitely grad school.
Absolutely. I mean, I live right outside the DC area, and so many folks that I know who I'm close with, friends, family, have been impacted by layoffs recently. And they've been reaching out to me saying, hey, I've never thought about business school before. What can you tell me? And I tell them to listen to Inside the GMAT.
Excellent answer.
So, okay, well, let's say that my friends or family listened to me and when I said apply to business school, you've identified that that's what you want to do. What's next? How do you pick schools? How do you pick programs? I know there's a lot of different ways to do this, but what's the Stacey way?
Yeah, I mean, the two big questions, again, that I ask myself and that I advise my students to ask themselves are, do you want to stay in the same industry or move to a different industry? Or are you flexible on that? You're not sure. And do you generally want to stay in the geography that you're in, or do you want to change geographies? Like, do you want to live where you are now and work where you are now, or do you want to go someplace else? And that's going to give you a starting point for just starting to, because it's overwhelming. There's so many business schools in the entire world, let alone just in the US or in North America. But that's going to give you a starting point to start to explore programs. If you are currently working in marketing and want to go into finance or vice versa, for example, you can be starting to look for programs that specialize in the area or that offer a certificate or whatever in the area that you're looking to go into. So that's where the industry question comes in. The geography question is simply a big part of the reason people go to B school is the networking, is the people that you're meeting and that you're hopefully going to add to your network and continue to tap into for years after you graduate. And post B school, most people take their first job post B school in the area in which the school is located. So if you are looking to change geographies, if you're, living in Chicago right now and want to go to New York, then consider doing that for school so that you're already there and so that your network is there. Once you get out, you've got a nice concentration there basically, because that will help you in those first few years.
Yeah. What if you want a more global career?
Yeah. So ditto if you're in Chicago right now and you want to be in London. So ditto, same thing. You may want to go straight there for school and not stick to Chicago or wherever for school and then try to make the move with your first job after. For recruiting purposes, for everything else, it's going to be a lot easier if you're getting, for example, your internship, if you're going full time and getting an internship between year 1 and year 2, if you're already in the geography where you want to be, it's, a lot of people will end up getting an internship and then getting an offer from that company. So you're already where you want to be.
Let's get a little bit more into the meat of this conversation, talking about tests. What role do or should tests play in this process of looking at where to go?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, some schools require a standardized test and some schools are test optional. There are very few, if any, schools that are what I'll call test blind. That's a distinct, test optional is not the same thing as test blind, basically. So test optional says we don't require a test, but if you take a test, we will and want to submit it to us, we will look at your score and consider it in your application. Test blind says we don't want it, even if you take a test, we don't want to see it. We do not look at test scores at all.
Will programs say on their application or requirements pages that they're optional, or will they say test
So
blind?
whatever their requirements are, whatever they do basically are on tests, they will tell you essentially what it is what their policies are. I don't even know any B schools that are test blind. You see that more at the undergrad level, that there are some schools that are test blind and don't use standardized tests anymore. But at the B school level, it's usually either they require a test or they're test optional. And so in terms of, do I take a test? Which test do I take? That question, the first question really is, where do you want to apply? Because if you're applying to a school that requires a test, then of course, if you want to keep that school on your list, you're going to need to take a test. If you are only applying to schools that are test optional, then you may or may not take a test. So what we found, and we actually did, every year we do an admissions officer survey. And so we ask the schools that report that they're test optional, we ask them, okay, what if somebody does submit a score and it's a competitive score for your program? Does that influence your decision on that candidate? And something like 88% of respondents in the most recent survey were like, yes, this would help your application if you submit, even though we're test optional, if you do submit a score that's competitive, that's going to be a plus for your application. So you could still decide to submit a score even to a test optional school for that reason. The other thing, just more broadly to think about, is that B school is a quant intensive graduate program. Stats, accounting, finance, econ. You're going to be doing a lot of math-based thinking and work in B school. And so you are going to need some way to demonstrate to the programs that you're applying to that you can handle the quantitative work that's going to be coming your way once that program starts. One way to do that is a standardized test. It's not the only way to do it, but one way to do that is just to take a standardized test and get a score that's good for that program. Other possible ways of doing this could be that you work in a quant heavy job. If you work in finance right now, you're going to make sure that your recommenders mention the quantitative aspects of your job and talk about how good you are at them to reassure the schools that you can handle the quant work. It could be that you took stats and calc and other quant-based classes in undergrad and got good grades in those. So that would come through in your transcript. You could also do something like go to a local university or community college or Harvard Extension School and actually take classes now. You'd want to take stats and calc, probably calculus, and get good grades in those classes. And so you could submit those, but you are going to want to make sure that somewhere in your application, you are showing the school that you can handle the quantitative requirements, because that's one of the biggest things that people struggle with when they get to B school. And so schools obviously don't want a situation where somebody starts the program and then struggles to finish it.
Absolutely. What you're reminding me of is my own experience applying to business school. And I applied, my number one school was test optional, but I knew that my background's in theater. I knew I was a long shot. So I took the GMAT exam to show that, hey, I can do this.
I can do math, I
I
promise.
can do math. And yeah, so obviously I'm really glad that I did.
I mentioned that there are multiple ways that you can demonstrate this quant proficiency. For most people, their undergrad classes and grades are already locked in. So you can't change that. If you already have it, great, but it is what it is. And ditto for your career, it is what it is. So if you have it already, great, but you can't really change it. The things that you have more under your control would be taking a standardized test now, or going and taking a class at a community college or something like that now, in order to demonstrate that quant proficiency. And I'll also mention, and I would love to know, Zach, how you felt about this yourself when you were doing this, but you also want that comfort level yourself to know. It's nerve-wracking to think that you're going to go into this program and then you're going to have all these classes, and are you nervous about yourself about being able to keep up? And I would imagine that you got some confidence out of taking the GMAT and knowing that you.
Yes. I mean, 100% yes. It was one of my biggest worries. I applied, I guess, what some would consider later in their career after making a pivot. And I knew I was going to be entering a class with people who, in some cases, were 10 years younger than me and had just taken all of the math classes in their undergrad. So I had plenty of nerves, not just studying for the GMAT, but heading into my first day. And while my nerves didn't go away completely, I still kind of got a little shaky when I got my first, homework assignments. At the end of my program, I was one of the math leaders of my cohort.
That's
It was,
fantastic. I love it.
yeah. And I'm not even just saying that, I was, and it felt really good, because growing up, maybe people listening can relate to this, where I demonstrated an interest in art, and then you kind of get labeled as that artsy kid, and the expectations of me from my family and my teachers was that this is a, arts and humanities guy.
Right. You're not the math guy.
I'm not the math guy. And that can become internalized over time. And it definitely was for me. So going back to business school, taking the GMAT, doing well in math classes was a huge boost to my confidence, and one of the best benefits, honestly, of having gone to business school.
I love that. I love hearing that. I will say theater's a little unusual. I don't see that one all the
Yeah,
time.
I'm not surprised.
But who are coming from nonprofit, who are coming from, I was going to say marketing, but nowadays marketing is pretty quant intensive as well.
Definitely.
Who are coming from areas that are less quant intensive, and who are nervous about that, both in terms of their applications and getting in, but also just in terms of feeling comfortable keeping up with the program once B school starts. It's a huge investment of both time and money to go and do this. And so you want to make sure that you're setting yourself up to get the most out of that investment that you're making in yourself and in your career.
And how much is business school these days? You probably are more familiar.
Yeah, if you're going to a full-time program, you're definitely looking at north of K per year. It's probably 50 to 90,000 a year, and most full-time programs are 2 years. And that's for tuition alone, essentially. You also, if you're going for a full-time program, you're not working those 2 years. So whatever you're earning those 2 years, plus whatever raises or bonuses or anything else you might have gotten, you're not getting that money either. You will, if you're going to a full-time program, you will typically have an internship for a couple of months over the summer between the first and second year. So you'll get a little bit of money back that way. But mostly, yeah, it's a huge investment. You still have all of your living expenses and your rent and everything else, and you're not earning money.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a big decision.
Huge. That's a big check. So is this the time to apply? Is this the time to take an exam?
Yeah. So first of all, for all standardized tests in general, the scores are typically good for 5 years from the date that you take the test. And most schools will require essentially that your score is still valid at the start of your program. So as long as you're taking the exam, within 4 years essentially of when you want to apply, so that you can make sure that it's still good throughout that application process as you're going through. And on top of that, applications are a lot of work. They're a lot more work than typically for grad school than they are for undergrad programs. A lot of undergrad programs will use the Common Application. There's only certain things you have to do differently for certain schools. For grad school and for B school, typically you are doing a different application for every school. They're asking for different essay questions, et cetera. And so there's a lot of work going into it. So in a perfect world, you would get your test out of the way before you would then go work on applications. So if you, let's say that you're applying for a full-time program and you want to do that in the US. So in the US, most deadlines will start in the September timeframe for first round deadlines. So September to January or so is when you're looking at deadlines for US full-time programs, most of them. They'll release those applications in typically May or June. So you've got 3 or 4 months there before you hit the first round, or a few more months if you're going to go for the second round application deadlines, which are usually in January. Ideally, you'd be done with your GMAT then before May of that year that you're planning to apply, so that you're not trying to both study for the GMAT and do your applications at the same time, just because both of them are a decent amount of work to get ready for.
And the applications will be different from each other based on schools and programs, but the test is the test, right?
Exactly. The test is the test. The test doesn't change, and it's a standardized test by definition, right? So the test is really steady. And because your scores are good for 5 years, you could, if you want to apply to B school in 2 years from now, you could take your test right now and just get that score locked in. And I have, the other benefit to this is I have actually, of studying in advance, is I have actually had students who were aiming for a certain goal score, studied for their test, and actually ended up exceeding their goal score. And that changed their application strategy. It changed which schools became competitive for them versus reach schools that they were less likely to get into. It changed their whole application strategy. So in a perfect world, like, you actually do better than you were thinking or aiming for. Knowing you already know your GPA from undergrad and knowing your test score, that's going to go into the story that you're trying to tell in the package that you're putting together for the rest of your application. And again, also just for your own sanity, because it's a lot of work to do this.
Yes, definitely a lot of work. And I've even talked to business school candidates who decided to study and take the GMAT or the GRE while they were still an undergrad before they graduated.
Yeah. So the only thing you'd want to be careful about there is most full-time programs will require a couple of years of work experience. So you just want to get the timing right. I wouldn't recommend that somebody in like their sophomore year of undergrad take the test, because you might run out of time there. But if you're in your senior year, if you've got a lighter load, maybe you got ahead on your classes or whatever, then I actually do think that that's a fantastic time. Get this test out of the way, go work for 2 or 3 years, and now you've already got the score in your back pocket and you can go do your apps and get in.
That sounds nice. So you've talked a lot about full-time programs. Does this strategy differ if you're applying to a part-time program?
So yes, potentially. So first of all, the timeline can be different. A lot of part-time programs, the application deadlines will be closer to when the program starts. Part-time programs also tend to have multiple starting times throughout the year. So they won't just do the August, September thing, but they might have a cohort starting in September, a cohort starting in January, and maybe even another cohort starting in the spring. So for those, it's just a matter of going and looking at the websites of the programs that you're interested in to see what their cycles are and to see what their deadlines are. It's also typically the case for part-time programs that the requirements or the averages for test scores are not quite as high as they are for full-time programs. And I say that a little hesitatingly, because a lot of times people interpret that as, oh, well, then part-time programs are not as prestigious as full-time programs. It's better to do a full-time program. And I don't actually think that's the case. I think that there are good reasons. There are certain good reasons to do a full-time program. There are certain good reasons to choose a part-time program. And for some people, part-time is actually better than full-time. We were talking earlier about whether you want to switch industries, whether you want to change your location, your geographies. If you want to stay in the same industry and in the same geographic location, there's a decent chance, it depends on your industry, but there's a decent chance that actually staying in your job is the way to go, because you're continuing to advance your career in that industry, in that geography, getting those network contacts through your job itself, while getting the practical knowledge that you want to get out of your degree. And so you're not interrupting your career, if you will, for a couple of years and interrupting your earning potential for a couple of years in order to go and get that degree. That would be a great case where I would strongly encourage somebody to consider doing a part-time program as opposed to a full-time program. And in fact, a few years ago, a family member of mine was in that position. And I told him, you should be doing part-time. You should not be doing full-time. Mm-hmm. And that is what he did. And he is now gainfully employed in a finance firm exactly as he wanted to be coming out of it. Like, it was the right call for him.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the only way I was ever going to be able to afford being able to go to school is if I could also work at the same time. And I know that's a reality for a lot of people. So that's not the reason why part-time programs exist, but it's a good reason for them to exist.
Agreed. Yeah, I didn't even talk about the money, but yes, part-time programs also tend to be not as expensive as full-time programs, just in terms of the tuition as well. So I think again, this goes back to doing your homework and figuring out what's right for you based on your goals in your career. But absolutely do not. I think it might be true maybe 15 years ago that part-time programs were seen as not as good as full-time programs. I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think there's any difference. I do think you need to look at what you're trying to get out of the degree and what you're trying to use it for, and that's going to tilt you towards one or the other. But there's no like fundamental thing saying that one of these is better than the other.
No, I mean, some of my classes in my program were mixed with students from different business master's programs who attended full-time, part-time, whatever. And the teacher
Yeah,
wasn't
it's the
giving special
same.
preference to half the
Exactly. It's
class.
the same material. It's the same. The knowledge is the same.
So let's say, given those timelines, you're thinking that folks study for the GMAT for 3 months, for
So let's talk about the timeline. So again, in a perfect world, hopefully you have the time to get your GMAT done before you need to start working on applications, although it's certainly possible to do the two together. Most people are studying for between 3 and 5 months. It depends on a couple of things. It depends upon basically the gap between your starting score and your goal score. So how much of an improvement are you looking for? It also depends upon how much time you're taking on a daily and a weekly basis to study. Some people have jobs that are 60 plus hours a week or have other outside commitments outside of their jobs or whatever, just have less time to study on a weekly basis than other folks. Different stages of life, different all kinds of things. But I would say the average for most people is about 3 to 5 months. And it's not unusual. I'll mention this too when we were talking earlier about like the difference between going to B school versus med school or law school. Medical school, law school tend a greater proportion of people going for those programs tend to be going straight out of undergrad. They're not trying to work a full-time job at the same time that they're getting ready for these exams. They're typically studying for the exams while they're still in undergrad. It's just a different a different period of life, essentially. For business school, people are typically working full time, at least for a couple of years before they go back to business school. And in your case, as you talked about, like you were longer because you were doing one of the career pivot things of changing industries. And so it's not uncommon for me to see somebody who will start studying. I was just talking to a student earlier today who took my class a couple of years ago and then decided at the time, this is not the right time in my career to go back to business school. But now is. And so she reached back out, and so I'm helping her get back up to speed again. So it's not unusual to have something where you might start studying or even get to the point of almost taking the exam and then deciding this is not right, and then you come back to it later. That happens. I will say if you find yourself in that position and you're pretty close to being ready, just go ahead and finish and take the exam. Because again, the scores are good for 5 years. So just get it locked in. And then if you do come back around to wanting to go to B school in a couple of years, now you don't have to worry about this piece of it.
okay, so 3 to 5 months, that makes sense. You mentioned studying daily or weekly. What does that mean? That means 40 hours a week?
Not 40. Oh God, not 40 hours a week. Your brain would melt. I like to think about this as like a university level course. So there's a lot of material to learn. You're going to be working pretty steadily. Ideally, you're viewing this as I'm doing at least a little bit of work most days a week. It's almost like an exercise program. I've got to do it regularly. I'm training this muscle up here, right? So I've got to do it regularly to keep it in shape and to keep building on it and
I think
making it
it's a
strong.
great metaphor.
Yeah. And if people will struggle if they wait until Saturday and then study for 6 hours and then don't do anything again until the next Saturday, because your brain just can't process that much new information all at once. So I tell my students, aim for 5 or 6 days a week. I tell them they are required to take one day a week completely off and not think about the GMAT because you do need a break. But aim for 5 or 6 days a week. On some of those days, it's not going to be very much. On some of those days, it might only be 20 to 30 minutes. On other days, you might have a longer session or a couple of study sessions. So you might take a practice test Saturday morning, which takes a little over 2 hours, and then go take a break and have lunch or go for a walk or something, let your brain clear, and then come back and spend another couple of hours reviewing that practice test that afternoon. So there will be some days when you're doing more. And then on other days, you're just going to be looking at flashcards for 5 minutes at a time throughout your day as you're going about your workday. Or you're going to do a set of practice problems, and then the next day you're going to review the practice problems. But you're doing a little bit every day, a little bit of exercise every day to keep your brain building those new memories.
In your experience, what are the signs that people should be looking for when they either need to take a break or the alternative when they need to get back to the books?
Okay. So let's start with the take a break side. When you find that you are dreading anything related to this, you don't want to sit down and study. Even if I say you can study whatever you like the best, you don't have to go for the thing that you're dreading because you don't like it. You can go pick the question type or the content area that you like the best and go do that for 5 minutes. And if you're like, I can't do it, okay, you need a break today. Another one would be classic signs of mental burnout. You read a sentence and you're like, wait, I don't know what I just read. I have to read that again. And then you read it again and you're like, I don't know what I just read. I have to read that. It's not entering your brain. If you find yourself doing that, what I tell my students again is walk away for 15 minutes. And when I say walk away, don't walk away and just start scrolling your phone for 15 minutes. Walk away and do something where you are not using your eyes to read or watch anything on a screen. And just see if that's enough. Then go back and try again and see if like that's enough to shake you out of it and let you get into it. And do what you're doing. Another little trick I use for myself when I'm like, I just don't want to start studying is I tell myself, you only have to study for 10 minutes. So you can literally set a timer and study for 10 minutes and then stop. And sometimes when I do that, I'm like, yep, okay, I'm done. Timer's off. I'm done. And I walk away. But a lot of times what I find is once I make myself get over that hoop of just, okay, just start, just do something for 10 minutes, then I actually get into whatever I'm doing. But if what you find is, nope, it's just not happening. I'm literally not able to process what's going on. My brain's not functioning. Or I did it for the 10 minutes and it's just not happening right now. It's okay. It's fine. My only rule for myself at that point is, okay, if I'm not going to do this study session that I planned right now, the only thing I have to do right now is I have to decide when I'm going to study instead. So I take this study session and I move it later today, tomorrow, whatever time I think I need. I have to decide before I set this aside, like, okay, this is when I'm going to come back. The other thing I'll say on the get yourself going again is if you go more than 4 days when you hadn't intended to take a break that long, then that's too long. It's okay to decide you're going to take a break for a week, you're going on vacation or work is really busy this week or whatever, and you've actively decided ahead of time you're taking that break. If it was like, oh, I plan to study those 4 days, I just keep putting it off and keep putting it off. Okay, now I need to do something to get myself back into this because now I'm in procrastination mode. And if I can't use one of my internal ones, oh, here's another one I use for myself, by the way. I tell myself that I'm earning time to go do something that I want to do. So for example, if I study for a half an hour, then I am earning an equivalent amount of time to go watch a TV show for half an hour. But I have to do the work first. I have to actually earn the time first. So again, that's a way to kind of get myself going when I really don't want to get going. If you find yourself, if your sort of internal mechanisms or you're setting those things up for yourself isn't working, another method to try is to make yourself accountable to somebody else. So ask a friend or a family member, say, I'm going to tell you my study schedule for the next week. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you after each study session, yes, I did this, or no, I didn't do it. But either way, I'm going to follow up with you and tell you. And if I don't follow up with you and tell you, Wednesday at 8 p.m. that I just studied for an hour, like I said I was going to, then I want you to follow up with me and say, hey, did you do this? And that's it. Like, that's all you have to say is, hey, did you do this? So you're putting that, you're making yourself have to be accountable to somebody else, which is, again, a helpful motivator for, okay, if I'm going to have to go tell this person in an hour that I didn't do this, maybe I should just go do it right now.
When I think about studying, I think about being by myself in a room, my head in a book. But that doesn't have to be the case, right? I mean, can 20 of those minutes be with somebody else who's studying?
100%. So there's a couple different ways to do this. So first of all, it can literally just be you study together, even though you're each doing your own thing, but you're there for each other in solidarity, basically, that you're both going to study right now. And that can be in person and that can be on a video call and it can be silent study, but just that you're doing this together. And so that can be a really great way. It's like an exercise program. You might each be doing your own exercises, but you're doing it together to help stay motivated that you're actually both doing it. You can also actively be studying together. So for example, you might get together and do a problem set where you do the same problems and then you talk about them afterwards and figure out how to solve them and how did you do this one and how did I do this one and what's the best way to do this one. So there's a bunch of stuff like that you can collaborate with. In my classes, I give my students the opportunity, if they'd like to take it, basically to join a cohort. So I set up a cohort of people who'd like to do live study sessions together. They just use Zoom or something like that. People who want to have some kind of async study support. So they'll set up a WhatsApp. And then people don't have to join one of the cohorts if they don't want to. And what I find is typically 80 to 100% of my students choose to join one or both of those cohorts. And I'm not involved in it. It's not like this is something that I get them started on it, but they're going and doing this on their own after that. I'll give them some tips and ideas about what they can do together or how they can structure things together, but I really let them take it from there. And I regularly hear from my students that they continue their study groups or their study cohorts after our class ends, as they're all continuing to get ready for their tests. So I think that's a great way, even if you're not actively studying together, even if it's an async chat thing that you're doing. And that can also, by the way, be your accountability measure that we talked about earlier with the group. And everybody might do that. Here's what each of us says we're going to do for this week. But it's an excellent way to feel like you're not alone in this, to have somebody, right? To have somebody come along and be doing it with you, and also to help you when you get stuck. And also, by the way, for you to help them when they get stuck. Because one of the best ways to know that you've really learned something, that you've really mastered something, is if you can teach somebody else.
Earlier, you mentioned taking a practice exam that could take upwards of 2 hours. Is that something that you would advise that folks do in a group, or is that more of a solo activity?
That one is probably the one solo activity. Just like when you're actually taking the real thing, you're in a testing center, you're taking it at home. You have to be like you are solo doing that. And also because the GMAT is an adaptive test, the practice test that you're taking is not the same. You're not getting the same questions as the practice exam that your friend is taking. So you can't even look at the questions together or anything like that. And in fact, I would caution you, don't show your friend the questions that you just got on your practice test, because they might get those same questions on a practice test that they take later. So you've just spoiled them for their practice test later.
No spoilers.
So no spoilers, no spoiler alert. So that's the one thing I wouldn't study with a friend. So practice exams, and so let's talk about practice exams overall. Obviously super important, both to get that experience of how this feels in the 2 hours, and I have to concentrate and getting my time management right and all of this stuff. This is also my gauge to see where my score is at and what kind of progress am I making. And am I getting closer at least to the score that I'm trying to get, my goal score on the test. And so we actually recommend, and we have people in our programs do this, we actually recommend that you take a practice test at the beginning of your studies, really before you've learned pretty much anything at all. You can learn the basics about here are the question types and here's how the timing works so that you don't completely run out of time. But in general, you're taking that first practice exam just to get a baseline, understand your starting score, so that you can compare that to the goal score, the average scores that you're seeing for your desired programs. That gives you an idea of your gap, how much of a score increase you're trying to get. So that can give you an idea of, am I going to be closer to 3 months or 5 months, or, what am I looking at in terms of how much time I might need to study? That's also going to give you your baseline for your strengths and weaknesses. You're going to be better at certain question types and certain content areas and worse at others, because we all have strengths and weaknesses. And so you want to know what those are right at the beginning, so that it helps you to set your priorities and to know how much more or less time you might need to devote to different sections of the test or to different content areas that are tested on the test. So it's nerve-wracking to take a test when you totally feel unprepared for it, but it's really important to just have that data. It's not about what your starting score is. Don't feel demoralized. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is what's your starting knowledge level. And then you can use that to know what to go after so that you can improve your score. You know what to actually improve. So the next time you take a practice test, your score is actually going to go in the right direction, which is up.
Definitely up. This is great. I actually just want to recap some of these best practices that you just laid out there before we keep going. So you said to typically study for 3 to 5 months, 5 to 6 days a week, maybe 20 to 30 minutes per day.
And I'll say, sorry, 20 to 30 minutes per day on a lighter day. And on heavier days, it might be 2 to 4 hours on a heavier day. In a week, you're probably looking at 8 to 15 hours most weeks.
Okay. And it doesn't have to be evenly divided.
Doesn't have to be evenly divided, and it's not going to be. On certain days, it's going to be a lot less, and on certain days, it's going to be more.
Okay, so 8 to 15 hours a week. Start with a practice test to establish that baseline. After you've established your baseline, feel free to study in the way that is best for you. Maybe that's solo, maybe that's with a group. And a great way to solidify some information could be teaching it. Actually, I love that. And I wanted to ask, are there other ways that you can sort of like prove to yourself, like, oh, hey, I actually do know this?
Yes, I feel comfortable with this and I can do it. Okay. So a couple of things. When you learn something, immediately try to put it into practice. Do something with it, right? It's really easy to read something and be like, oh, that makes sense. And then 3 days later, you have no idea what it is, or you don't know how to use it. So you learn, how to handle percent increase. And the next thing you're going to do is do a couple of practice problems that test you on percent increase, or do some drills that test you on percent increase, so that you can just put it into practice and make sure that you actually know how to do it and not just, oh, this makes sense. The other thing I tell my students is whenever they do any practice problem and they're going to the explanation afterwards, they're not allowed to simply read through the explanation from start to finish, because it's way too easy to read it through. That makes sense. And then completely forget it within 48 hours. So I want you to use the explanation as though it's like your little private tutor who's living in your brain in a non-creepy way. So your private tutor is, every time you get stuck, your private tutor's like, oh, here's an idea. Here's a hint. Here's something to do. So when you start looking at an explanation, you only read it long enough until your brain's like, I didn't think of that, or, oh, there's an idea, right? You have that little like aha moment. As soon as you have that aha moment, you set the explanation aside and you go push that new idea as far as you can on your own. And at that point, if you want to, because you're in explanation phase now. So if you want to go look something up in your book, oh, my book talked about this, and let me go read what it said, or what was that formula again? You can go look up whatever you want. The stage is open book. You've already tried the problem, so that's okay. But you don't go back to the explanation until you get stuck again. So you push it as far as you can. And what you're doing now is you're actually making yourself figure it out, as opposed to just reading how somebody else is telling you how to do it. And if the more you figure it out for yourself, the more likely that is to stay in your brain. And you're going to make the kind of memory that allows you to recall it 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now when you need that piece of information again. So super important to be doing that. And then the other super important thing to do is you have to get yourself to what I call an action takeaway. An example of not an action takeaway would be, oh, look, I just made a careless mistake on this problem, and my takeaway is don't do that again. What do I do with that? I'm probably going to make the same mistake again later this week, because all I'm doing is telling myself, don't do that again. You have to get to the point where you say, okay, what mistake did I make? Why did I make it? What can I change about my habits to not make that same type of mistake in future? And then how am I going to make that happen? What new habit am I going to practice for the rest of this week so that that becomes the new way that I do this, so that I don't make that careless mistake again in future? You've got to get yourself to an action. And I'll give you a really simple one of my own that I swear is real. I actually have to do this. For some reason, my brain mixes up 2 + 3 and 2 × 3. My theory is that when I was 6 years old and first learning this, I mixed them up, and then it's back here in my brain, deep in my brain somewhere, and that's it. It's just in there. And so I constantly will mix them up. What I've discovered is if I write them down, I won't mix them up. But if I just say it out loud, or I do it in my head, I have a pretty good chance, especially in the speed of the test, of mixing them up. 2 + 3 and 2 × 3, but I will mix them up. And so my takeaway is when I see 2 + 3 or 2 × 3, I will write that down. Every time. I don't do this with 2 × 4 and 2 + 4, because I never make that mistake.
Of course.
But I do it where I know I make mistakes, right? And I literally remember a couple of years ago, I was telling a class this and giving this as an example. And then we went and did a math problem. And I seriously, in that math problem, I can't remember I think it was 2 × 3. And I literally did it out loud and made the mistake. And then they were like, haha, you illustrated it. We get it. And I was like, what are you talking about? I had no idea that I had just made that mistake because I didn't write it down. So it's this kind of thing where you get to that takeaway, you realize that, oh, here's something that I want to do, or here's something that I want to do differently. And then you have to put the takeaway in the form, when I see X, I'm going to do Y. That's the action part of it. What's the clue that I need to see in the first place that's going to trigger this memory of, oh, hey, there's something to do? And then what action am I actually going to take when I see that thing? And so now my really simple one is when I see 2 + 3 or 2 × 3, I will write that down. And so you can do this basically at every level of your studies, whenever you get to it. When I see this kind of problem, I'm going to estimate. When I see that I can estimate, I'm going to immediately glance at the answer choices to see how far apart they are, which will tell me how heavily I can estimate, right? So you're setting up all of these things of as soon as I see it, when I see X, that's the clue. I do Y, and that takes you through the test.
Okay, so what if I'm studying? I just started studying today. How do I approach all of this? I know there's different tests, there's different sections on different tests. Is there just a standardized approach that you have?
What's your study plan? So if you're using some kind of a study plan from, a test prep company or something, obviously follow whatever study plan they gave you, but you can also come up with your own study plan. I generally recommend thinking of your studies in 3 broad phases. And this is what, when we're setting up our courses, this is how I'm organizing things. Phase 1 is basically your primary studies. So this is, for the first time, I'm learning what are all the different question types and how do they work and what are the strategies for working through them efficiently? What are all the different facts and rules that I need to know and drill and make sure that I can actually do? These are mostly math facts and rules. What am I doing time management wise? How much time should I be spending on average, and how long is too long, and when should I cut myself off? All of those kinds of things. So I'm learning everything for the first time. That's phase 1. And that's typically the longest phase just in terms of elapsed time, because there's a bunch of stuff to learn for any standardized test. And through that phase, you're periodically taking some practice exams, but it's more about learning a bunch of things and then just taking the occasional practice exam here and there. Once you've been through everything, you're like, okay, now I know all the question types. I know, at least in theory, I have learned the major content areas and the strategies and the whatever. Then you're going to go into what I call the review and improve phase. So the review and improve phase is basically a series of cycles of 2 to 3 weeks. And any cycle begins with a practice exam. So you take a practice exam, you analyze that practice exam, and you use that to say, okay, what are the best opportunities for me to improve based on the data in this exam that I just took? And you come up with 2 to 3 weeks worth of what am I going to go after to get better? And when I say the best opportunities to improve, what I don't want you to do is go after that question that you looked at and were like, I don't know what's going on. And even when I looked at it afterwards, I still don't know what's going on. That's not a good opportunity improvement. That's a good guess fast and move on opportunity. Good opportunities for improvement are things like careless mistakes because you were almost there, or I got this right, but it took me longer than it could have. I can do this more efficiently next time. Or I did legitimately get this wrong, but it's something I feel comfortable learning. When I look at it now, I see what I should have done. I just need to go practice that so that I can do it next time. So basically, yes, something didn't go perfectly with that question, but there's an opportunity there that you can identify to get better. You go do that for 2 or 3 weeks. When you feel like you've made good progress towards whatever you identified from that practice exam, you repeat the cycle. So you go take another exam. That's your test, first of all, to see whether you succeeded on those things that you just tried to improve. And hopefully what happens is you have indeed succeeded on most of those things. And that gives you a new pool of things to go after for the next 2 to 3 weeks as your new best opportunities to improve. And so you're doing a series of these cycles, and as needed, that's driving any review that you need to go do. When you realize, oh, I forgot my exponent rule, I probably need to go just do a general review of exponent rules. Or, oh, I was doing this critical reasoning question and it was a strengthened question, but I accidentally answered it like it was a find the assumption question. I need to go review what those 2 questions are actually asking me to do and make sure I'm doing the right analysis when I answer these questions. And so use that to drive what are the things you need to review. What you're not doing during the review and improve phase is literally just going back and reviewing everything of everything that you studied during your first phase, because you don't need it all. You have strengths and weaknesses. So you're driving your review based on that. And then the final phase is the shortest phase. The final phase is, I call it peaking on game day. So you are now an Olympic medal contender of the sport of your choice. I'm going to use tennis as my analogy because that's my favorite sport. And the gold medal match, game, run, whatever, is coming up in a week. How do you make sure that you're at your best on game day? Because our skills are, if you don't sleep well or you had a bad day or whatever, sometimes you're just not as good that day. But on other days, you have a great day and you score higher. So you're setting yourself up in that last week to 10 days to be at peak performance when you get to game day. And what you're doing for that is a bit different than what you're doing in those earlier cycles where you're really trying to learn stuff.
So given all of that, what are the best practices for approaching a business school specific test?
Yeah, so business school tests that are designed for business school, they're going to test you on basically 2 broad things. They're going to test you on certain math concepts, facts, and rules. And they're going to test you on certain types of analytical or logical reasoning. And so you're going to need to learn those math, facts, and rules. And you're also going to need to brush up on your skills and improve your skills on this analytical or logical reasoning for the different question types that are used on whichever exam you're choosing to take. The interesting thing is that some of the stuff that you study, like let's talk about the math, facts, and rules. Some of the stuff that you study won't really be used in business school, and then some of it will. So it's more, they're not expecting you to have already taken accounting and finance and to know this stuff. They're going to teach that to you once you get to the program. The material that they're testing you on is material that you learned mostly in high school and maybe even middle school. And again, it's sort of like some of it will actually be useful for business school and some of it won't. So as an example, geometry was taught in high school. It's not really used in business school. Possibly if you talk about it in terms of reading graphs, yes, but I would call that more data analytics. Pure geometry is not really used so much in business school. If you are, this is one of the changes that came into place a couple of years ago when both the GRE and the GMAT changed their exams. On the GRE, all geometry topics are still tested or are still fair game because the GRE is actually used for more than just business school. So the GRE is used for programs that do where geometry would matter. On the GMAT, the area of coordinate plane, which is adjacent to graphs and like graphical reasoning, that's still tested, but the rest of geometry isn't tested any longer. I applaud GMAC for that decision, by the way. I think that was the right call because do we really need to know how to find the area of a cube or a sphere for business school? No, it's not relevant. So you will to some extent be learning certain things for these tests that aren't necessarily going to also help you in B school. It's really just for the test. But there are a number of things, and the proportion is really greater on the GMAT, but there are a number of things that will actually help you to get ready for B school itself. So anything stats related, anything data analytics related, obviously you're going to be using those things every single day in business school, and they are tested on these exams. As I mentioned, there's a heavier focus on those things on the GMAT than there is on the GRE. Things like percents, ratios, fractions, also super commonly used in business school. And by the way, all of these things, not just in business school, but in business, like in a business career, you need to be able to be comfortable talking about ratios of things or analyzing data or any of that. Obviously, it's something we do all day long. And then also what I'll call it the ability to translate a math story, like a quantitative narrative, right? Like there's a little story, but it's got math in it. And what is it saying? And how do you translate that into something that can solve a particular question or answer a particular question that somebody's asked? And again, of course, this applies to standardized tests. But again, this is a lot of what business school is about. And a lot of what having a career in business is about, is being able to talk to other people about quantitative based topics and quantitative based reasoning. So getting yourself ready for these tests will actually help you with a lot of those skills that you're going to be using on a daily basis in business school and really even out in the working world.
That makes a lot of sense, especially as somebody who's been to business school, works in a business field, works for a business test. But that was very quant focused and data focused. Where does verbal reasoning play a role in that?
Yeah, and I'm going to call it like verbal or analytical reasoning because I think we call verbal reasoning and then it makes it sound like we're only talking about the verbal section of these exams, but really you're using analytical reasoning or verbal reasoning across the entire exam because a lot of the math problems are stories, that sort of thing. You can kind of think of the quant or the math side of things as the what's this information, what's this data? And the analytical side of things, or the more verbal side of things, is the so what? What does this mean? What should we do about this? Should we launch this new product? Should we buy this company? The decisions that you're hopefully going to be making someday as the CEO of your own company. So you're marrying these two things together. And actually, I will say without trying to sound like I love the GMAT, but I do. I think it's a great test. Again, a lot of the changes that were made to the new version of the GMAT that launched a little over a year ago, it feels much more like real life. You put these pieces together of I've got the what, and now I need to talk about the so what. They feel much more like the kinds of case studies that you're looking at in business school, where you've got both quantitative and qualitative information, and then you've got to wade through it and make some kind of decision about it or calculate something from it. All of these changes were fantastic and spot on to make this particular test a lot more relevant for, I assume you did it for the business schools themselves because they wanted to see that their candidates had these skills, but also more relevant for someone who's getting ready to go to business school because these are the kinds of skills that you'll need to use in school itself.
I appreciate you saying that, but I have to ask you a question. Do you have a favorite question type? And why is it data sufficiency?
I do really like to teach data sufficiency. You're right. I actually also like to teach multi-source reasoning. And I think it's for the same reason for both of them. It's because when people first see them, they're freaked out by what's going on. They're so different from standardized test questions that they've seen in the past. And so they look at this and they're like, I don't know what's going on. And once once they can wrap their heads around how is this question type constructed and what is it really doing here and what are you trying to do, it's like a revelation. And for data sufficiency in particular, the thing of beauty about data sufficiency is that you've got a math-based problem where you mostly don't have to do the math, which I love. It's do you understand enough about the math that this is talking about that you can tell whether the math can be done. But then you don't actually have to go bother doing it, which is perfect, frankly, for the setting that you're sitting in a standardized test, but trying to go to B school. Because in B school or in the working world, you are never doing math on paper. You are never doing math without Excel available. Like everything and anything math related is happening in Excel. But of course, that's not happening on the test. So give me a question type where I can tell you how I would set up the solution, how I would approach the problem. Don't actually make me do the math. Yes, I can go do that in Excel if you hand me the tool. And so once people wrap their heads around that and understand like, oh, okay, this is how I'm thinking about it. And this is what I'm doing. It's not about solving the math. It's about knowing whether I can solve the math. It's just a revelation. And MSR, multi-source reasoning, this is probably the question type. When you ask people which question type do you like the least, this is probably the one that comes up the most commonly because there's just so much information. So multi-source reasoning questions were designed, as I understand it, were designed to mimic case studies so that you get in business school. You get this download of all this text and graphs and tables and all this information. And you have to be able to wade through it and combine information from different places in order to address a question. And again, it feels so overwhelming when you first look at these. And this is why people hate them when they first start studying for the test. And if you can take them through and show them, no, this is what it's like in the real world. In the real world, you do get inundated with information. And in the real world, when your boss comes and asks you to answer a question, they never hand you exactly the information that you need to answer the question. You have to go find it. And then there's all this information and you have to figure out what you don't need just as much as what you do need. So as you're teaching people how to understand, first of all, that this is what this question type is doing and how to handle it, again, you're seeing this revelation as they get that, but also this is the most directly relevant to business school and to the working world, because this is really how it happens. Standardized tests historically are really artificial. I'm going to give you this weirdly worded thing with only exactly the information that you need. And real life doesn't work that way. So multi-source reasoning and really the data insight section in general is much more relevant to how we actually process information and get information and process information in the real world. And so as you're getting better at that for this test, you're getting better for that for everything that you do.
What prep products would you recommend for somebody to begin to feel as passionate as you do about these question types?
The people taking this test, you do not need to love this test. You just need to get good at it, good enough at it to get the score that you want for the program that you want to get into. There are two broad categories of things that you're going to be looking at to get yourself ready for the materials, to get yourself ready for this test. Starting with official materials. So GMAT makes available all kinds of real past test questions and real official practice tests that contain real past test questions and use the algorithm that's used on the real test. So these are the best things to study from because it's the real deal. These are really questions that people were evaluated on in the past. So you definitely want to incorporate those in your study. The official guide, books, and the official practice questions, actually, we buy for all of our students and give them to them as part of our programs because they're just absolutely, you can't study for this test without those resources. And so those are the real deal and the best practice because they're the real questions. In terms of learning the content, the strategies, the et cetera, that's more in the domain of test prep companies like my company. And so there, what you're looking at is materials that will help you to learn the content and to learn the efficiency. Time management is a big deal on this test, to learn how to solve at speed without making mistakes, all of that kind of stuff. And generally speaking for that, what I would say is actually for both sides, I would say start with the free materials. So we have a free starter kit. I know GMAC has a free starter kit. You've got a couple of free practice tests in there, which are great. So the very first thing I would do is basically go get everything that's freely available and just start with that material. We also make available to everybody for free our Foundations of Math program. This actually used to be something we sold. It was a paid program, and right after the pandemic started, we were like, let's just make this free. Everybody should have this foundational level playing field. So you can go onto Amazon and look for GMAT Foundations of Math. The Kindle version of the book is free. It's the full book. It's not just it's a 500-page book with a million math drills in it to just get those skills back that you haven't been doing math on paper since you were, 14. So get that. We also do live workshops regularly, again, around foundations of math. And again, they're completely free. So just go out there and get the free material and get yourself started. On the foundations of math piece in particular, I recommend everybody do that, even if you have a degree in a STEM field. My degree is in biology. I like math. This is still super useful for me because what you're learning how to do is a different way of thinking about math. You can't just pull out your calculator on the quant section of the test anyway, because you don't get a calculator on that section. So there's different ways of thinking about how to approach or think about this material in a way that's about your ability to reason logically about it, as opposed to just picking up a pencil and writing down a formula and trying to solve that math. So really everybody should be looking at the foundations of math level and doing that first before they get into their main studies, because it's going to change the way that you do math or think about math in the first place.
So before we go, we talked about a lot of great stuff. What would you say are like the key takeaways that somebody could do right away after listening to this episode?
The first thing I would do is go to mba.com if you haven't already and sign up for your free account. You're going to get the free starter kit. That's got some free practice problems in it. It's got the 2 free practice tests in it. The other thing that I would do is go sign up for the free starter kit with Manhattan Prep, full name Manhattan Prep powered by Kaplan. But again, we have a free starter kit. Go sign up for that and just start to look at the material that's in there. Start to orient yourself on what's on this test. What are the question types? How does the scoring work? Get the basics down. The next thing that you're going to go do is you're going to go take a practice test. And you're totally not ready for it. And you're going to, but just take it anyway. Just take the practice test so that you can learn your starting point and you can learn your starting strengths and weaknesses. And at the same time, you're going to go and you're going to start to be thinking about, where might I want to go to school? And you're going to go look at their websites. It's okay if you're not sure yet. Go look at their websites and just start to get a sense of what they're saying they'd like to see in terms of average scores. So they all post average scores for their students, their admitted students. And that gives you an idea of the differential between what your starting point is right now and what kind of score you might be wanting to aim for as you get through your studies. And then from there, do foundations of math, as I talked about earlier. And then from there, you can where are my strengths and weaknesses at this point? What's that differential between where I am right now and what I'm trying to get to? And then your next decision is basically, do I want to keep studying on my own? Do I want to try to find a study group? Do I want to take a class or work with a tutor? If I'm going to study on my own or set up my own study plan, what materials do I want to use to help me do that? And from there, you'll be in a much better position to set up whatever you want your study plan to be.
All right, listeners, are you ready now to peak on game day? I think yes. Remember Stacey's key advice. Give yourself 3 to 5 months of preparation, studying 5 to 6 days a week for about 8 to 15 hours most weeks. Some days will be naturally lighter, others more intensive. The magic isn't in perfect consistency. It's in creating a sustainable routine that works for you. And yes, take those breaks when you need them. They're not just allowed, they're essential for your success. And who knows, maybe by the end of your prep, you'll even find yourself looking forward to those multi-source reasoning questions that once seemed so intimidating. It happens more than you might think. For access to the Manhattan Prep resources that Stacey mentioned today, visit manhattanprep.com. And for the official GMAT free starter kit or to register for the GMAT exam, head over to mba.com. I'm Zach at GMAC, and this has been Inside the GMAT. Until next time.